So, with me on this edition of Orns podcast is Geoff Wicken. He is the editor of the Watford Treasury magazine, puts together a lot of great things in history about Watford Football Club, and he's actually working on another edition. He tells me volume 8 of the Watford Treasury. And this is the magazine and what it looks like for those of you who may not be aware. And with me now, on this edition of Orns is the one and only Geoff Wicken. Geoff, welcome to Orns.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
And it's so lovely to have you here. Thank you very much. Geoff, I do want to talk about a stretch of Watford history on this particular podcast episode from 1881, the inception of Watford Football Club, to around the wartime era in the 1940s or thereabouts. And I think what better person to have on than you to talk about this unique period of Watford's history. And I'd like you to start with the very beginning of Watford and some of the people who defined and shaped Watford in the 1881 period, that early part of Watford's history. So, if you start, I will certainly be asking a few questions here and there. But if you could start off with the inception of Watford at 1881, please, and talk
Yeah.
about that.
Okay. Well, it's a bit messy at the start, partly because there's not a lot of information around, and partly because at that time, organised football was in its very early stages. So, one date that it's worth keeping in mind is 1898. So, I'm going to start by saying that the club became known as Watford Football Club in 1898. However, you can trace the lead up to that all the way back to 1881, and that's why 1881 is the date that's used for the club's formation, because the people who were involved in setting up a park side really did that in 1881. And the 15-year-old boy who brought the ball along to the first kickabout in Castlebury Park was a man called Henry Grover, or a teenager called Henry Grover. He and various of his friends started kicking around in the park. Among the friends was Charlie Peacock, who later became the proprietor of the Watford Observer, the local newspaper. So these were sort of quite well-connected lads within the town. And there were various other groups, but they soon became the dominant town team. And they were entering the FA Cup by 1886. So even within 4 or 5 years, they were playing FA Cup games, the first of which was against Swindon Town. So they went under the name of Watford Rovers at this time. And they moved around various locations around the town, and until in 1890, they joined forces with the West Herts Club and Ground, which is a sports club that still exists in the town, but they joined up and became the football section of West Herts. So then they had a permanent home at Cassio Road, and they started really being quite successful. They won the Herts Senior Cup, the County Cup, 2 or 3 times around the late 1880s and early 1890s. The fierce rivals were St Albans at this point. And Luton were just up the road. They were probably the second fiercest rivals, soon to become the fiercest. They joined the Southern League in 1896, but they were still an amateur club at this time. They weren't paying the players. A number of the other teams in the Southern League were professionals, and West Herts, I should say. They had now changed their name from Watford Rovers to West Herts. They turned professional in 1897. There was a rival club in the time called Watford St Mary's, who also turned professional, but the town couldn't support two professional clubs, and within 8 months of that, I think, the two had joined forces. It was positioned as a merger, and they were very careful to use the word amalgamation, but it's pretty clear that it was the West Herts, former Watford Rovers guys who had the dominant position and ran the committee, and the new club Watford that was formed at that point in 1898 took the place that West Herts had previously had in the Southern League. So that's the tale of how they got from 1881 to becoming professional in the Southern League and called Watford FC, and all of that was in place in 1898.
Now, and I appreciate your outlining that history, Geoff. I wanted to ask you about the uniforms, the jerseys, the kinds of colors that Watford had, because as we all know, and some of the listeners may or may not be aware of this, Watford's colors weren't always what they are today. And I was curious to find out from you if they start what the colors were, because we know that they have evolved through the eras. And in this particular era that you've just outlined, what was their uniform, their jersey like? What colors were their kit at this point in the early part of their history?
Well, they changed fairly frequently, actually. Club colours. I don't know quite why they changed. Just a new lick of paint, I suppose. But you didn't have a club associated with a certain colour in the way that you do today. And these days, when clubs try and change their colours, the fans are up in arms, and they won't let them get away with it. Witness what happened at Cardiff a
I
few
was just
years
thinking
ago.
about that. Yes. No, that's a
Um,
great example. Yeah.
yeah, so at different times in those early years, they played in light blue and dark blue halves. There's actually a existing picture of Watford Rovers, and the shirts didn't quite match. So in some cases, the left half was light blue, and in some cases, it was the right half. And you've got this squad picture of them wearing ill-matched shirts. One of the other colours, interestingly, at the time, was yellow and red vertical stripes, and then we think yellow, red, and green vertical stripes. It's a little bit hard to tell because all the photographs, or the very few photographs that exist, are in black and white.
Right.
They switched to white around the end of the 19th century, going into the early 20th century. And then there was a period between 1904 and 1909 where they played in yellow, red, and green hoops.
Wow.
Horizontal stripes. Then after 1909, they switched to white, and then black and white stripes, and then blue, and then finally sort of gold stroke yellow. But it's quite interesting, they've ended up with yellow, in which they've been playing since 1959, but with the red and the green, yellow was in the past way over 100 years ago as well. So interesting evolution, I suppose you could say.
Most definitely indeed. And you've taken us with that illustration, Geoff. You've taken us, and we listened to what you're saying here very closely to 1898 and just the turn of the century in the 1900s, early 1900s. In this period of time, from the 1900s, say, to the World War One and just past that point, can you talk about some of the people who made Watford Football Club or put it on the map in terms of the early part of the 1900s? Some of the characters, if you will, who kind of were personalities in their own right in distinct ways. Can you talk about that and the history from around 1900 going for, through the early part, I guess, the wartime 1910s, 20s,
Yes.
etc.?
Okay. So probably one of the most important figures in the very early part of the 20th century was actually the chairman of the town council. This was a man called Ralph Thorpe, who was known as the Prince of Good Fellows. And the reason he had this name was that he was a man who took his civic duty very seriously. And this was in the days when, you know, the dignitaries of the town sat on every single committee that there was and ran the fire brigade and goodness knows what. The club had got promoted to the first division of the Southern League in 1900. And then in 1903, they got relegated again back to the second division, at which point Thorpe reached into his pocket and basically kept things going with, I think it's believed that he invested £2,000 to £3,000, which at the time was a very significant amount of money. And what they did was they hired as the first manager a man called John Goodall. Now, John Goodall was one of the great stars of Victorian era football. In the very first season of the Football League, Preston North End had won the double, FA Cup and Football League. This is 1888-89, and he'd been their centre forward. He was their star player, really. By 1903, he was 40 years old, but still, you know, nationally renowned. You know, the biggest star of his day, and Thorpe brought him in as manager of Watford. So this was, you know, a remarkable coup, really. They went through that season unbeaten and earned themselves locally, at least, the nickname of the Invincibles.
Oh.
And got themselves promoted back to the first division of the Southern League, where they remained just about. They were the better sides for most of that period. But Goodall remained as the manager for 6 or 7 years until 1910. Really quite an interesting character, as well as being an absolute superstar player. He had played cricket for Derbyshire. He'd played lawn bowls internationally. And he also kept pet foxes, which when he was manager of Preston, he would walk them round at half time around the stadium to give them some exercise. He settled in Watford after he finished being the manager and ended up as the groundsman at the Cassio Road ground. And later on, he ran a caged bird shop in Market Street in the town. So really quite a remarkable character. He was buried in an unmarked grave when he passed away during the Second World War in Vicarage Road. There's a cemetery just across the road from the stadium, as you know. And he was put in an unmarked grave in there. And 2 years ago, the club invested in a proper gravestone, so he is now properly commemorated in the graveyard across the road from the stadium, which is all quite appropriate.
Yes, yes.
So he left his post in 1910. The most significant thing that happened then, under a new manager called Harry Kent, was that they actually won the Southern League in 1915, by which time the First World War had started. So there was, you know, the popular newspapers were unhappy that professional football had carried on, and there was quite a lot of trouble and controversy about footballers not doing their duty, and they should be signing up for king and country and going and fighting the First World War in the battlefields of France. That died away a little bit as people realised that actually putting on football games was quite a helpful sort of leisure activity for getting people's minds away from the war, even if only for a short period on Saturday afternoons. But organised professional football did then stop in 1915, and so Watford were the last pre-war champions of the Southern League.